Hello and welcome to another edition of OAuth Happy Hour. Today it is just me here. Micah is still on vacation. I hope he's enjoying himself. So I will be hanging out with you today and talking about OAuth and answering your questions and talking about what's new in the world of OAuth. So if you are joining us on YouTube or on Twitch, welcome, and feel free to ask questions in the chat. And I will go ahead and just chat for a while about whatever comes up. We'll see who we've got here. And if you are in the chat, go ahead and introduce yourself and say hi, and let me know if you're here. Otherwise, I'm just going to start rambling about who knows what. So, yeah, let's just jump right in. Trying to think of what's new in the world of OAuth. That's usually a good place to start. The working group work has continued to happen, and we had a recent meeting, and there's another meeting coming up in a week or so talking about some of the new developments and the new specs. There's also been some new work going on with the technically completely separate effort by different IETF group called GNAP, which was formerly known as TXAuth or transactional auth or whatever you want to call it. That's sort of where the brand new work in OAuth is going on. It's not really OAuth yet, but it's the same sort of idea of a delegation protocol. And that meeting at the IETF, the official meeting at the IETF, was on Monday. And that was the first meeting since the changes about changes to the big changes to the spec, and also the new editors, myself included, were announced. So that was a good meeting. Got through a lot of good discussion. Most of the discussion was around process and such like that, because we're trying to decide whether to use mailing list or GitHub issues for discussions on the spec, which is an interesting problem in spec development. And this is, I remember this happened at the W3C as well several years ago, where the mailing list is the official place that these discussions happen. That's the official on the record. That's the sort of, it's logged, it's hosted. The logs are hosted on the W3C domain, or in the IETF case, their domain hosts the logs, and it's the official record. And as I'm sure many of us are very familiar with, mailing lists are not actually a great format for discussions. And it's not very fun to have threaded, detailed discussions on a mailing list when you want to be able to then look back at the list and pull up and refer to things. Not the best interface. And GitHub issues, it turns out, in the meantime, have been a great way to work on, to have discussions in detail, keep track of what are the pending issues and things like that. So a lot of communities independently decided to just start using GitHub issues to discuss things, although that's not technically on the record. So in the last couple of years, IETF and W3C and these kinds of organizations have had to make a decision about, do we call the mailing, do we keep using the mailing list? Do we let people, or even both, do we let people, or do we prevent people from using GitHub issues? And that is, it's an interesting problem, because GitHub issues are, it's in the GitHub silo. It's not part of a community-owned thing, and it is, those discussions don't really have a permanent place on the web, right? GitHub, we're assuming GitHub's going to be around for a while. Hopefully they are. They could disappear and take all that discussion with them, right? So ideally, we need the official on-the-record stuff to have a permanent home, which is what the mailing list is for. So it's this interesting split of how do you deal with that? So there's actually a document, a spec, of course, that the IETF wrote up about using GitHub in the IETF. So it's a draft. I forget the draft number now, but that one, if I had thought to dig this up ahead of time, that would have made sense. Okay, I found it. It is 8874, and it is working group GitHub usage guidance, and it talks about how a process for working groups to use GitHub to develop specs. And I think it's really interesting that there's, now a more formal process for that. So the idea is that every working group is free to choose their own tools for discussing and working on the specs, but a lot of people do want to use GitHub. So that's what this new group is doing. The spec officially lives on GitHub, and that is it's an organization maintained by the chairs of the group, and it is the discussions are expected to take place on GitHub, but then any sort of major things, any sort of major decisions or major things that need to go on the record do need to get posted to the list. And then the other half of that is there is an automatic roll up of the discussion threads after based on a week's worth of discussions. A bot goes and pulls a list from GitHub and then sends an email to the list linking to all the discussions that have happened. And that's the sort of hybrid approach that we're taking with this now, which I think is great. So I think it's a good balance there. Striking a good balance there. So anyway, that's what I've been up to this week. I had to do a full read through of the new GNAP spec, and I've been providing feedback on that, and some of that was coming up in the discussions and in the discussions on Monday during the meeting. So I think that was a productive session. Lee asks, "Is that an old timey Mac behind me?" It is one of the old Macs, and it was actually one that I never actually owned one of those myself, but that was family friends of ours owned that one, and I used to go to their house and play Asteroids, or what was it called? Maelstrom. That's the one on that machine. So that was a lot of fun. It does not boot right now, unfortunately. I think I need to fix the hard drive, and I do want to resurrect it eventually and figure out what to do with it. I was thinking about trying to put a Raspberry Pi into it and wiring up the Pi to that monitor, like that CRT, but then having the rest of it just be the Raspberry Pi. So I know people have done that before, but that's also like a little scary because that's serious high voltage in there if I open that up. Anyway. Yeah. All right. Any OAuth questions? You guys y'all gotta give me some questions so I know what to talk about. Otherwise, I'm just gonna be rambling about spec processes because that's all I've been doing. Well, it's not all I've been doing. I've also been doing a lot of workshops lately. So I've been doing a lot of the workshops that I do, teaching people about the specs, and those are really fun because I get to find new ways to explain concepts as well. And one of the new analogies I've been using, which I really like, and I need to now turn into slides because I still haven't made any slides for this yet. And I need new illustrations because I need a cat as one of these characters. But it's the idea of the fact that the browser's front channel, using the address bar to move data, is kind of like using a package delivery service. So we always talk about the front channel in OAuth as, it's using the address bar to move data, which means it's less secure because there's more ways that things can be stolen out of the address bar, whether that's because things are getting logged by other servers, or it's because it can be intercepted by the user intentionally or by a browser extension on the user's machine, or various things like that, which are the sort of technical reasons that it's not secure. But I like to think of this analogy of using a package delivery service. So if you think about the back channel, which is a HTTPS connection from a client to a server, that connection is very secure, and that's like hand delivering a package. So you can walk up to somebody, you can see who they are, they can see who you are, you can see that nobody is nearby, and looking at what's written on the letter, and you can see that nobody's stealing the package, and you can see that you gave it to them and handed it off, and that they've taken it. That's great. That's like secure. The front channel is like sending something in the mail, where you're paying a delivery company to deliver this box. You've paid postage. You generally believe it's going to work. It probably will, because that is their job. and things mostly work fine. However, when you put something in a box and send it in the mail, you then don't really get to see if it got delivered. You actually don't get any confirmation, right? You might get a tracking number, and you might be able to see the tracking number say it's been delivered, but that doesn't really actually tell you that it's been delivered. It tells you that the delivery company says it's been delivered. It's a claim they're making about it. So once you put something in the mail and send it, it's sort of out of your control, and you don't really get to see it anymore. You don't know if it's been delivered. You don't know if it's been stolen, or you don't know if it made it there, but then was also copied along the way. So anything you send in the front channel has that problem. And there's a similar problem on the receiving end. When you receive a package, it's got a return address on it. There's no guarantee that that's actually who sent it, right? You actually have no idea who sent it. The only way you could know is if you had some other signature thing that confirmed it. So so that's the problem with receiving things in the front channel. So if you put those two together, it's actually, you're kind of just sort of missing half of the picture on each side. And that's the same with the address bar. What's happening with the address bar is one piece of software, the authorization server, is trying to send something to the OAuth application, the client, whether that's an access token with the implicit flow, which is now it's clear why it's bad, right? Or it's the authorization code in the authorization code flow, or it's an ID token with OpenID Connect. It's going to send that through the browser, which means it's handing it off to a third party, the browser, to deliver it. So now you have this problem on both ends. The OAuth server doesn't actually know if it's been received, and the thing receiving it doesn't actually know if it's from the OAuth server. And this is what leads to the kind of the mix-up attacks that we talk about, of like the authorization code injection attack, where if an attacker can swap out the authorization code with their own, it's like, swapping the package in the mail, where it's it might look like it's the legitimate, or swapping the contents of the package, I guess, right? You open up the box, swap out the contents, keep the box going in the mail. It makes it, however, it's got something different inside, and the receiver won't really know. And so that's the problem with the front channel. So we have to patch that up, and there's a few different ways to patch it up. What OpenID Connect did was go and add a nonce parameter, so that when you make a request for an ID token, you generate a nonce and you send that, and then when you receive the ID token in the front channel, it contains that nonce, so that you can see that it's actually was intended for you. And because the ID token is also signed, that's how you know it wasn't tampered with in transit. You don't get that with access tokens, which is why the implicit flow is a terrible idea, because the implicit flow in OAuth puts the access token in the box, in the mail, and then ships it. And then you're missing that on both sides. You're missing the picture of whether the access token was from the OAuth server and whether it was actually not stolen. So yeah, that's the new analogy I've been using, and I like it. And what I want to do is I want to get my illustrator to make a new cat that's a little delivery person wearing a little delivery suit. I think it would be very cute. So I need that for a slide. Cool. I see a couple questions are coming in. I need to run over there really quick because I need to open the door in here, because I just spray painted a bunch of stuff that's on my floor drying, and I am definitely going to regret it if I am inhaling those fumes all day. So one second. I'm trying to make everything on my desk bright white instead of black equipment, so I'm spray painting everything white, and that paint is very toxic. Yes, okay. Thank you. I'm glad you like the analogy. And hello to Chili. Thank you for joining. This is a good question. Speaking of front channel, what's up with browsers blocking third-party cookies that break single-page apps, PKCE implicit? So, yeah, this is an interesting one. This is a recent change that browsers are doing to lock down on the ad tracking capabilities that a lot of websites are doing. And one of the ways that those ad trackers work is you will embed a iframe or JavaScript or image or something from the ad network on your website. And then a bunch of websites do that. So the ad network has a bunch of different publishers. And then every time, so when the browser first visits the page, it goes and fetches that iframe or whatever it is. That then sets a cookie on the domain of the ad tracker. And then when you're on a second website and it loads that iframe, the browser sends a cookie, which makes sense because you're like, oh yeah, this is how cookies work. The problem is that then the ad network is able to follow the user along from every website they visit. So that means that the ad trackers get the browsing history of the user for any websites that are using that ad network. And if you think about Google Analytics, they're in this position too, where not only is Google Analytics reporting to the website owner the stats of how many views they're getting, but because basically everybody uses Google Analytics, Google actually knows every individual person and their browsing history because they cookie them. So that's the problem. So as soon as that started really getting abused for ad tracking, then the browsers started deciding to change the policy around cookies. So the new rule is that if you are embedding like an iframe, it won't send the cookie along back to that website if it's embedded in a different website, a different domain. And that stops the ad tracking from working. It still can serve an ad. That's fine. It can identify the user. I think you can re-identify the user that comes back to your website, but then it stops working across different domains. So you stop being able to follow the user across the internet. And the theory is that this is good for users because it is more privacy centric. Feel free to correct me if I'm getting any of that wrong. The cookie stuff and the ad tracking stuff is not the world I usually spend time in. But why this affects OAuth is because, actually more like OpenID Connect, because that's really where they take advantage of it, is if your OpenID Connect server is on a different domain, and if you want the ability for the application to be able to silently refresh a session, like an OpenID session, it works the exact same way that these tracking things do, where you're on the application domain, like exampleapp.com, it embeds an iframe from your authorization server, and then you put in the query string prompt equals none, which tells the OAuth server not to display an interface, only to just immediately redirect back with the tokens if they're logged in still. And then the application can grab it out of the iframe because of the way that the JavaScript works there. And that's the sort of silent refresh of tokens that lead to a good user experience with these applications. So that's what's being, that mechanism is the exact same mechanism as a ad tracker, which is unfortunate. And that's what's being blocked by browsers now. So it's not stopping OAuth from working, because if you do a redirect-based flow, this is not a problem, right? Because when you do a full-page redirect, your browser then is on the authorization server's website, and then it makes a request up to there with cookies because there's no tracking ability there. And that is, so that part's not breaking. So like, you can still do OAuth in a single-page app with PKCE if it's a redirect flow. You just can't do the silent refresh of inside of an iframe. Downside of opening my door is now a bee is flying in. You're going to see it in a second. There it is. Great. Okay. So that's the story there. Thank you. Thank you, bee. Yes, please go in front of the camera. This is wonderful. Does the spec allow token introspection endpoint to have a side effect such as extending a single sign-on session? And is it a good idea? Oh my God, this is Not what I expected today from this stream. I'm fighting bees here. It's either that or I get high, so take your pick. Great. Likes all of my lights. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. This is terrible. This is terrible. What a disaster show. Okay. God. Okay, I might have to figure out how to get this bee out of here. If I suddenly disappear, it's because I've been eaten by this giant bee. Okay, it's somewhere else now. Maybe I'll go find out the light. Oh, it's right back here again. Good lord. Bees and paint. What a day. This was not a good plan. I should not have started that paint project right now. How do I get a bee out of my laptop? Just hanging out on my desk. Okay. Good lord. Get out of here. Get out of here. All right, it's hanging out over there. Does the spec allow token introspection endpoint to have a side effect such as extending a single sign-on session, and is it a good idea? That is an excellent question, and I don't know the answer, so let's go find out together. What I'm going to do is, let me see, let me share this Chrome. See, if I had Micah here, I could just be like, Micah, take over so I can chase this bee out of here. Okay, somewhere in here is a link to the token introspection endpoint, and let's see if there are any security considerations, which is where it's going to say stuff like that. There are many ways for an authorization server to determine whether a token is active. Resource servers are using token introspection endpoint. Must check all these things. Sure, check if it expires. That bee is back. Now it's on my keyboard. Oh my god, it doesn't look so healthy, actually. It's like, oh, it's gone. Okay. I'm gonna close the door most of the way. Hopefully that's just enough to not have it come back. So I don't know. I don't think it should, because if you are, what you're doing here is you are, what you're doing is you are, the token introspection endpoint is something that the resource server or the API uses to check if a token's valid, not the application, right? So the application is not going to be using token introspection endpoint. It's for the API, the resource server. So it doesn't make sense to have it extend the session because the question is whether it's valid. So no. That is, yeah, that's not a good idea. Okay, so the bee is my guest today. Bees and paint. Okay, here's another question. Can you tell me the best way of using OAuth for mobile games using device ID? By device ID, do you mean the device ID that the phone reports of, like, it used to be called, what was it? UDID on the iPhone. And then they changed that again because people were tracking users across apps. And instead, now it's now they have a special thing called like the ad identifier. I think that's what it's called on iPhone. So that doesn't really have anything to do with OAuth, because OAuth is about EMEI. No, that's the phone SIM. That's like the SIM number. UUID is something else. I think it is UDID, unique device identifier, or something from Apple. I don't remember what Android calls it, but it's, in any case, that doesn't really have anything to do with OAuth, because in OAuth you want a user to log in, and the thing identifying what they're logging into is an application, not a device ID. So the other part of the answer is, if you're on mobile, then you would be using the authorization code flow with PKCE, and you would not have a client secret. And the client secret wouldn't be safe to put in a mobile phone, in a mobile app, because the app wouldn't be able to keep it secret, right? It's just if you tried to compile a secret into a mobile app, anybody could decompile it and see the secret, so it wouldn't be secret anymore, so it doesn't do anything. So you don't use the secret in mobile. So yeah, I think that answers that. Let's see. Best practices for creating and using scopes. This is also a good question, and this is a tough one because there's no rules. There's no rules. It's just figure it out on your own. What I will say is there are a lot of sort of common patterns that do emerge when you look at people's APIs and what they've built. So a very common one, for example, is separating read and write access, where you want to be able to provide read-only access tokens to some applications. So for that you make a scope for write access, for the ability to update data. And then if the application does not request that scope, then the token is going to be a read-only scope. And that's a a good first place to start. The other thing you can do with scopes is separate out unrelated functionality of your API. So if you have methods that manage a user's photos and then methods that manage a user's contacts, even if it's part of the same API, you can add scopes for those. And that's another good place to start exploring, of like, figure out, do you have API methods that manage different kinds of objects? And if you do, then think about, do you want to be able to allow or prevent certain applications from being able to modify other unrelated things if they only need to operate on certain kinds of objects. What else? We have sensitive information. If you have anything that's considered sensitive, whether that's like private repos on GitHub or someone's the details of something, where a summary might be less sensitive. So a summary of a user's bank accounts and balances is a lot less sensitive than transaction details within an account. So you might have a separate scope for transaction details. That way applications have to request it. There's another good one, which is if you are building something where there's the ability to like have a user purchase something or pay money, you can make a separate scope for that one as well. So you can say, like, you can browse the catalog with any access token, but in order to actually check out on your cart and finish your purchase, you have to have a special scope in that access token. What that lets you do is it lets you have different policies for the tokens that have the ability to check out. So you can say then the access token that can check out a cart will only last for 30 minutes, and then all other access tokens last for like a day. And that way you get long-lived access tokens for the better user experience, but then you don't want the risk of longer-lived tokens to be able to do an operation like check out a cart. So those are some things to think about. It is interesting because it is very specific to the particular API you're building. at the end. There's only so much guidance you can get from somebody else. All right, what other questions we got? I think I had some in Twitter, from Twitter. So let me see if I can pull those up. Feel free to tweet me questions also. Nope. Too many weird DMs on Twitter. Okay. Yes, I found some notes for other questions. Oh, this is a good question from Eric. What's the danger in using localhost port as a redirect URI? Would something else have to be compromised in order to exploit that? So I'm assuming if you're considering using localhost and a port as a redirect URL, then you're probably building a public client, not a confidential client. A public client can't use a client secret, and what that means is that the only way that the OAuth server has of confirming the app's identity that it's about to issue the token to is based on the redirect URL. So even with a single page app in a browser, there's no running like on a domain, like on a website. There's no client secret, but the OAuth server is only ever going to redirect back to that URL with the authorization code. And then, while it's not 100%, it is still much higher confidence that the OAuth server is actually taking the user back to the real app. If the user is trying to trick the OAuth server, you can, right? You can just like go find the public client ID of any single page app, do an OAuth flow yourself, steal grab the redirect URL out of your own browser and go get an access token. And then, your custom code has the access token, not the single page app. But generally it's more, there's more confidence that the OAuth server is redirecting the user back to the real application when it's based on a domain name. So the problem with localhost and a port is that confirmation then no longer exists. So the OAuth server then loses any confidence it has of which application is actually going to be getting the access token. And that's not to say that it's, you shouldn't ever do it. It's just that you lose that assurance. So as you're thinking about the different policies and lifetimes and whether to issue refresh tokens and how long those should last and things like that, that's one of the factors to take into consideration. So as far as the actual security risk, if you're using localhost and a port as a redirect URL, like on a laptop, anything else on the laptop will be able to see that, right? We'll be able to would have the ability to see whatever is happening in the redirect. Now, if you are using PKCE, then the chances of actually something going wrong is very low because only the application, because the thing coming back in the redirect doesn't actually do anything by itself anymore. You have to have the PKCE secret, which is in the application, which is presumably in memory, which presumably nothing else on the machine can read. So PKCE kind of takes care of some of that. And so it's not bad, really. But yeah, what you lose is you lose the identity assurance of the application. And the two things that solve that are the redirect URL, not solve, but help, is the redirect URL, which is some level of assurance, and then the client secret, which is generally considered 100% assurance, although you can't use a client secret in a desktop app or a mobile app. So hopefully that clears things up. It's a good question, though. Okay. Paceto versus JSON Web Token. I don't like JSON Web Token because you can't invalidate it on a will. I believe you also can't do that with Paceto tokens because they're also a structured token. I think, let me show this screen. This is a blog post from Randall talking about Pacetos, and this is the structure, base64 encoded string from this JSON. Now, this has the exact same property of a JSON Web Token in that once you create one and give it to somebody, you can't change it. So you can't revoke it. Same problem, right? This is the problem with any structured token format. If you pack information into a token and then sign it or encrypt it or both, and then give it to somebody, and then you're like, actually, I want that to expire now. Well, if the thing reading it is only looking at the token, you can't change the token because you've already given it up. Think about it like, this was another analogy I started using, which I need to make new slides for, of this is the same problem with passports and state IDs. If you, like there's security features on an ID card that people generally trust, right? It'll be like certain holographic bits or like a double photo that would be too hard to recreate in a printer. And because of that, people accept the security features of the ID in a lot of cases alone. So you go to the store, you want to buy some wine at the grocery store. They say, show me your ID. They look at the ID. They make a determination about whether it looks fake or not. And then they look at the age on the ID. And then they give it back. That's exactly the same as looking at a JSON Web Token, right? Or Parecki token. You look at the token, you make a determination about whether or not it looks structurally valid. In the token case, you'll be doing that by looking at a signature, which is cryptography, which is a lot more secure than just looking at a piece of paper. But same idea. You're looking at that object to make a determination about whether it's valid. And the person who is using that, who's going to be getting the thing by using that token, is holding on to it. Now, let's say that for some reason the state decides that they want to revoke my ID. And they do that. Well, where does that information live? It lives in the database that the State Department controls. I'm still holding on to my ID card. And it says it expires in 2 years from now or whatever. And if I go show somebody at a grocery store that ID, and they decide, they look at it and they say, yes, this looks like a legit ID. It hasn't expired yet. They're going to let me through, or they're going to let me make the purchase because they've only looked at the ID card. And in reality, that ID card isn't valid anymore because that information lives in the state database. But in order for the grocery store clerk to know that, they would have to check that central database, which they don't do. So this is the same problem with JSON Web Token and Parecki. Any kind of structured token format. If the thing that's accepting that in a request only looks at the token, then you will never know if the token's been invalidated for some other reason before it expires. So that's the situation. They have to go and check the database. They have to go check the OAuth server and ask, hey, is this token really still valid? And then, only then, you will know if the token has been invalidated or revoked. So that does not change when you change the token format. The problem is that you've handed the token to the application and then they bring it to the API. So it doesn't matter what format it's in. There are plenty of problems with JSON Web Tokens that Parecki does solve, but that's not one of them. Here's another great question. What are the issues with the implicit grant flow versus PKCE? I want my developers to not use the implicit grant on a single page applications. Please suggest. So we did talk about this a little bit earlier, and I also should point you to a good video to watch about this. It's like a year old now, but it's still relevant. If you go to OAuth.net, go to the implicit flow, this video, what's going on with the implicit flow? Let me just drop this link into the chat. So that link and the video, this does a pretty good job of explaining what's going on. And This is from last year, actually a year and a half ago, but it doesn't matter. It's still the same stuff, still relevant. I should go add table of contents to this now that that's a feature on YouTube. But basically, the reason I'm bringing this up is because if you want to send people something they can watch that hopefully will make the argument for you, that's a good thing to send people. But the short answer is the implicit flow issues access tokens in the front channel, and the front channel is like a delivery service where you are putting it in a package and handing it off to somebody else to deliver. And while you may trust them because you're paying them, or you believe that they're going to do their job, you can never actually guarantee it. And there are plenty of ways that can be stolen. And if it's stolen, you will never know. So because of all of those things, we want to deliver the access token to the application in the back channel. So what PKCE does is it changes the thing issued in the front channel to just a one-time use authorization code. You could think of it like sending like a coupon in the mail, where in order to use it, it's then protected by something the app makes up at the beginning of a secret the app makes up at the beginning. So in order to use the thing sent in the front channel, you can't even use that thing by itself. You have to include something else instead that you made up that can't be stolen yet. So yeah, I'm not going to rehash the whole video here, but that's a short answer. And do check out that video because it goes into a lot more detail of the problems. And we made that video specifically to help people understand the problems with the implicit flow and help give people a resource to use to send to other people talking about that. All right. Got any other questions here? I'm looking through some of my other notes. So, okay, here I got a question earlier about token introspection, and with token introspection, there's an introspection endpoint, which is let's see, I think I had a link up to the spec here, but the token introspection endpoint is documented in an extension, and the idea is that it provides a way for a resource server, not an application, a resource server, to check whether a token is valid. So that if you are using opaque tokens or structured tokens, but you don't want to have to deal with decrypting them or something, you can make a request to the introspection endpoint, which is on my OAuth server here, sending the token, and then the OAuth server returns back the response about whether it's valid. So this is that's the idea. The question is, why does that endpoint require authentication? So typically you'll see that, and this is not something the spec requires, but many servers do require that that call to be authenticated. Actually, I said that wrong. It actually is required. To prevent token scanning, the endpoint must require some form of authorization to access this endpoint, such as client authentication described here, or a separate access token. Could be anything. So, for example, the resource server makes a request to the introspection endpoint, passing the token that's being asked about here, but it has to authenticate itself here. And then in this one, it's a username password instead of a bearer token. The question is, why is that required? And I do think that the token scanning attack argument isn't actually very compelling, because if you want to just, if the system is using tokens that are so short that they can be scanned, like you just start counting up from one and check to see if that token works, then increment the number, then check if that token works. Like, you could do that at the resource server, right? Like you could send an API request using whatever token you make up to see if it works. The resource server will then ask the introspection endpoint. So I don't think that having the introspection endpoint require authentication to prevent token scanning attacks is useful, because it doesn't actually really add any benefit. It just means that attackers are going to go try that at the resource server instead. However, the better reason for this is that if the resource server is authenticating, then the introspection endpoint knows which resource server is asking about the token, which means that the authorization server might say that a token is valid for one resource server and not another, and now it knows who's asking, and it knows whether or not it's valid. It might even return different data depending on what resource server is asking about it. So that's a much more compelling reason to me compared to just the token scanning attack. A couple other questions here. Token introspection endpoint doesn't allow to scale authorization servers, so many public OAuth servers like Azure and AD don't support introspection endpoint. Yeah, that's interesting. It's not something that I would recommend. Yeah, so if you are, so like Okta does have an introspection endpoint. However, don't hit the introspection endpoint for every single API request your resource servers get, because it's not going to scale because that's too much network traffic, right? You don't want to add that much network traffic into the whole system. So instead, it's better to, using a structured token format like JSON Web Token means the resource server has a way to validate tokens without going over the network. And then you can only do the introspection for the ones you care about, like if you need to double check that a token hasn't been revoked. Not supporting introspection at all is an interesting decision, and I don't necessarily agree with those OAuth servers' decisions to just not have one. I think it's a good idea to have one, maybe even like one that's rate limited, so that you can't misuse it. But not having one is a weird decision. Thanks for all the questions. Okay, many times I have issues with token bloat when I use post method to post token from IDP to browser body. Can't we have a token size standard because different browsers have different body limits? If you're having this issue, then I would seriously reconsider how much is in your tokens. I think there's a lot of downsides to packing a lot of data in tokens, and at the point that you're running up against the browser limits, I think it's way too much in there. And I would sort of reevaluate what you really need to be in that token and what you could instead look up through introspection or some other method. Is there a way to prompt a user for MFA verification again in a session that was already established through OIDC? I think there is. I think there is. What is it called? It is called, where are the specs? So in OpenID Connect, there's I'm looking forward to this getting cleaned up too, because we don't need all these hybrid flows. Most of them are silly. Okay, initiating. Oh my gosh, this. Okay, what a long spec. Where is it? It's authentication request. What I'm looking for is yeah, here we go. Prompt. So when the app makes a request, we're looking for a way to ask the user to ask the server to force MFA. So for example, we have prompt none, which is used for the silent refresh in an iframe that's breaking. We have prompt login, which means the OAuth server is supposed to get the user to authenticate again. Consent and select account. So ACR values. Is this the one? space separated strings that specify the ACR values that the authorization server is being requested to use for processing this request. I think this is the one. So specified in section 2, ACR, authentication context class reference. This is the one. So, wow, okay, this is a mess. Authentication using a long-lived browser for cookie is one example where the use of level 0 is appropriate. Authentication with level 0 should not be used to authorize access to any resource of any monetary value. That's an interesting sentence to have in the spec. So we have to go look at this other spec. So I think yes. The answer is yes. You have to go figure out what in this spec is the value that says MFA. They're not going to let me download this, are they? This is one of those. Buy it. No, I'm not going to do that. So there's a mechanism in the specs. The easiest way to figure out if you can do it with the particular OAuth server you're using is to look at the docs of the OAuth server. So, but it looks like there is a mechanism that is meant as a standard mechanism for doing that, which is cool. And yeah, cool idea. And Derek says, Okta uses sign-on policies that can be set to prompt the user for MFA in an OIDC session. That's a good point, too. The client doesn't even necessarily have to request it. It could just be a policy that the OAuth server has. Is there a way to set the token expiration lifetime to under 5 minutes on the Okta default authorization server? Token expiration lifetime. We like it to match the session lifetime of 1 minute. I don't think there is. I think 5 minutes is the smallest access token lifetime you can set. That's pretty fast. Much faster than that, you're going to start ending up with some weird problems. I'm also very curious about session lifetime being 1 minute. That seems very short. If I'm using an access token as a session token on a single page app, what's the best way of implementing an inactivity timeout? Call to the resource server counts as activity. If you're using an access token as a session token on a single page app, what's the best way? I don't think you should use an access token as a session token. I think that's the answer. If you use an ID token as a session token, your application can parse the ID token and look at the timestamps in it, for example. But otherwise, I think the other way to do this is just do it all with timers in the single page app. Because your single page app knows if it's going to be making a request. And if you're just trying to have a timeout, the app can be keeping track of when it's making requests and see that it's not making requests for 5 minutes, and then send a revocation request to the revocation endpoint with the access token. I think that's the answer. On behalf of flow or API chaining, avoids users' consent and shares users' data without user consent. Should such mechanism be allowed? It depends. So, like, user consent is definitely a important piece of the puzzle, but there are some cases where you don't need it. So, depending on what you're building, it's okay for an application to get access to stuff without the user having to confirm it. Totally just sort of internal policies at that point about what you want to be allowed. It totally depends. So, like, well, for first-party apps, for example, not on behalf of, but just for first-party applications, you don't usually put a consent screen in the flow, because if you downloaded the Twitter mobile app and the first thing it did when you logged in was you saw that prompt that's like, hey, the Twitter app is trying to access your Twitter data, that would be weird. So you don't want the consent screen for first-party apps. You actually just want it to just go through. So, but as for on behalf of or it's totally just internal policies about whether or not you want that to work. Did I skip a question? All right, cool. Well, this was fun. We had a surprise guest, the bee flying around my face. That was delightful. And hasn't come back. And I'm not breathing in paint fumes because I have cracked the door open. So everything is better now. But we are just about at the top of the hour. So I think I'm going to wrap up here. And let me just say where you can find me next. So I actually have a event coming up this evening. It is a lunch and learn in Australia. I'm not going to Australia because we can't do that right now, but I am going to be there virtually. And that is at noon tomorrow in Australia, which is actually tonight here at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time here. So that is going to be a talk all about OAuth 2.1, talking about what's new, what's coming, and sort of the direction that stuff is heading. So feel free to join, even if you're not in Australia, it's fine. You can just come hang out and learn more about OAuth 2.1. And thanks for all the questions. The other place to go to find future events and future workshops and things like that, octadev.events is a great place to go to see what's coming up. And we have today, tonight, and then tomorrow I'm doing the last part of the workshop talking about APIs. Feel free to join that as well. It's free. It's part 3 of 3, but you don't have to have come to the other 2 to still have that make sense. So feel free to sign up there if you are interested. And with that, thank you all for joining. I hope you had a good afternoon, morning, wherever you are, and I will see you in 2 weeks.